Today's presentation will be made by my colleague Chris Taylor, and it's about understanding barriers to digital connectivity. Chris is the director at Plum. He's a specialist in communications and media regulation. He's held senior positions in the public and private sectors, and he was formerly director of consumer policy at Ofcom, where he led the regulator's capability to address demand-side competition issues with a focus on real consumer experiences and outcomes. His presentation today will last around 25 minutes, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. If you have any question, please do not hesitate to write them in the dedicated Q&A box during the course of the presentation, and we will answer them at the end. So I think we're all good. I'll turn it over to you, Chris, now.
Very much, Aude. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all see my slides. I'm Chris, as Aude's already introduced me. I'm a director at Plum. As she said, I used to be director of consumer policy at Ofcom, so I have a natural and professional interest in consumer engagement with digital technology and in the factors which may constrain that and how to overcome those constraints. And particularly now, as policymakers, regulators around the globe and here in the UK are focused on digital infrastructure, very keenly focused on digital infrastructure and how to ensure good quality networks extend everywhere we want them to go and everyone has the opportunity to engage with them. I think we can sometimes overlook the demand side factors which constrain people's use of digital services. So in this presentation, we're going to look at both demand and supply side constraints on engagement. I'm going to look globally and then also zero in with a little bit more of a focus on a deep dive, which we did in the UK in one of our projects in Plum. As Aude has said, please put your questions, comments in the comments or Q&A section. Because I'm focused on my slides, I might not initially see them, but we'll pick them up at the end or one of the Plum team will signal them to me. So this slide just tells you who Plum are. I'm sure some of you are familiar with us. I'm not going to dwell on it. If you want information about Plum, you can find it on our website. So a little bit more about the context for this webinar. Digital connectivity and usage are considered to be important or even vital by policymakers, consumers, regulators, all kinds of stakeholders around the world. And I can illustrate that with two quite simple quotes. One from the ITU. The ITU says, ensuring inclusive, equal access and use of information communication technologies for all. And that's a priority of theirs. And then the World Bank describes it in this way. They say, digital technologies are at the forefront of development and provide a unique opportunity for countries to accelerate economic growth and connect citizens to services and jobs. So that's quite important because we see two concepts there. One being broader economic growth, which is beneficial to us all, and then also individual consumer citizen benefits like access to services and jobs. And we can unpack that a little bit more. We know that digital services are increasingly important. They're a significant contributor to economic well-being and to social cohesion. And each of us experiences this multiple times every day. I suspect everyone on this webinar, all of you delegates, will use digital services for your daily entertainment. It gives us good access to goods and services which we wish to purchase. Perhaps more importantly, we can also use it to access online government and community facilities. It's important in our social lives. Some people may think it should be less important in our social lives, but social media is a big and continues to grow a feature of our daily lives. It enables us to engage with essential services or important services like health and education so that we can work and learn from any location. And increasingly, digital facilities are improving healthcare as well. So we can see it's really important. And the other side of the same coin is that those people who are unable to engage in digital services are significantly disadvantaged socially and economically. And we sometimes describe that as digital divides. Digital divides are creating disadvantages, not just between us as individuals, but between different nations, different regions, between communities as well. So with that little bit of context, I just want to introduce our agenda to you. We're going to talk about, well, we've already spoken about why it matters. I'm going to speak a little bit more about that as well. We're then going to look at different types of digital divides by developing a typology. We're going to look at why some of those digital divides exist, what some of the barriers to digital inclusion are, both on the demand side and the supply side. And then we're going to look at our case study, which is a deep dive. It's a piece of work we did for the Cheshire and Warrington Local Enterprise Partnership here in the UK, where we looked at the state of digital connectivity, both on the demand and the supply side, what might be holding people back from engaging, and then a little bit of a review of how to improve engagement. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. And I'm also going to talk about current opportunities there are here in the UK, in Europe, and elsewhere in the world to improve digital engagement through various initiatives for legal and regulatory reform, which are happening. So that's our agenda. I hope you find it interesting. So coming back now to this theme of why this is so important, and I've picked up another quotation here from the ITU, which is helpful. The ITU says, people and communities that are connected and possess digital skills are empowered to access information, online health services, and life-saving disaster warnings. They can pay for goods and services, stay in touch with loved ones, increase productivity, or perform better paid jobs. And again, just in that statement from the ITU, we see the concept both of private and public benefits. We all enjoy private benefits, benefits to us as individuals from being able to engage with and use all kinds of digital facilities and usage, but there are public benefits as well. And public benefits arise from positive externalities, which is where the consumption, in this case, of digital goods or services can cause a benefit to a third party. And so it's quite well recognised by economists and thought leaders and regulators that use of digital services provides benefits broadly across society, across the economy. It provides economic advantages as well. And there's some illustrative examples of that here in this table on the slide, just using three fairly obvious use case examples actually. So online healthcare provides each of us who access it with a private benefit. We have easier and quicker access to services. We can sometimes access services from home. We don't always need an appointment where we need to go to the surgery physically. And these services are available to us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In terms of public benefits, if we all use digital healthcare, then there will be improved outcomes for public health. There will also be public benefits for education, because the more healthy the population is, the more they will have opportunities and time to access education services as well. And there are obvious advantages for employment. There are financial advantages to the public purse because there'll be more efficient and cost-effective ways of providing these services. So we look at online education and online public services as well in this table, but I'm not going to go into each of them in the interest of time. But you could easily make this a much more complex matrix. You could add other types of use cases here. These three are quite important, but you could perhaps look at, digital commerce or social media, or even look into the future and look at artificial intelligence, for example. And various studies have started to quantify these benefits as well to demonstrate this is not just a theory, but there's empirical evidence and quantified empirical evidence to show that these benefits of digital engagement are real. So having understood those benefits, and hopefully they're non-controversial, we can start to develop our typology of digital divides. And the first thing I'm going to focus on is looking globally and internationally. And we can see that the digital divide between developing and developed countries is significant. And this is a real concern to policymakers globally in institutions, international institutions such as the ITU. The chart on the left there shows the percentage of individuals using the internet, and we can see fairly parallel development of those two lines. The bottom line is least developed countries, and the top line is global, actually. So it's important to understand, looking at these charts, this is not a comparison between developing countries and developed countries. It's a comparison between developing countries and global trends. So we can see parallel development of those lines broadly, and for obvious reasons, the development in developing countries starts from a lower baseline. What we can see on the right, though, is that even with that parallel growth in use of the internet, we see a broadening gap between developing countries and global trends in bandwidth consumption. And what that tells us is the digital divide between developing and global trends and developed countries is getting wider if we use that metric. And that will always be a concern, I think, to policymakers, because what I think we're tending to see is however fast the world moves, or however fast developing countries and policymakers in developing countries work to try and close the digital divide between developed and the developing world, it's always going to get wider. They're always going to have to run even faster to catch up. I won't say any more on that, but though it's a very interesting topic, we could probably spend a good deal of time just on that individually, but I only have 25 minutes. So the digital divide is multi-dimensional. When people talk about, I find, are talking about that global digital divide, but there are all kinds of digital divides. Firstly, there are digital divides within countries. So when I talk about the geographic digital divide on this slide, we're not just talking about the gap between developing and developed countries. We're talking within countries and between communities. And that geographic digital divide can obviously be a result sometimes of connectivity gaps, for example, between rural and urban environments, between sparsely populated and more densely populated areas. And we're all fairly familiar with that. And I think policymakers in every jurisdiction are trying to find ways to narrow those digital divides. We find digital divides by age, with older sections of the population typically on average less inclined to engage with digital technology than younger cohorts, often sometimes because of attitudinal factors, resistance or distrust of digital engagement. We see obvious digital divides as a result of income. The lower your income, the less able you are to be able to afford connectivity or services or handsets. That's a fairly obvious point, but again, it's one where it's quite easy to diagnose the problem, but it's more difficult to come up with solutions to it. And policymakers are thinking about interventions for that all the time. Linked to that, your employment status is another fairly intuitive driver of gaps in digital engagement. There is a gender digital divide. Those of us working in developed countries will know less about this, or at least will experience it less, because it's less of a factor. For example, if you look across Europe, roughly 90% of men and 90% of women are using are online. So there isn't really a gender digital divide there. But if you look in the least developed countries and look at ITU data, that tells us that 43% of men are online and only 30% of women. So there is a gender digital divide, which is of concern to policymakers looking at digital divides between countries and in developing countries. And then there are sometimes digital divides driven by impairment or disability. Increasingly, there are technology solutions to overcome those digital divides, but sometimes we've found regulators have had to intervene in order to create those solutions, because even though the technology exists to serve those parts of the community, sometimes it's uneconomic. So there's less of a strong commercial case to provide bespoke services for a smaller group of the population, and so there's had to be regulatory intervention to overcome that. So just moving on from our typology and talking about what drives digital exclusion on both the demand and the supply side. Well, as we know, there are supply side gaps in connectivity, and they're not very difficult to understand at all, because they will happen where there is not a network, or there is insufficient quality of network for people to be able to use digital technology effectively. So this is driven by lack of infrastructure, or poor quality of infrastructure. But then there are usage gaps as well. So even where there is good quality connectivity, or the availability of good quality networks, we know that there are things which constrain people from using them. And understanding what those things are and overcoming them is one of the most interesting policy challenges, I think. So I've produced a little list of these in the right-hand side of the table you see on this slide. These demand side barriers can arise firstly because of connectivity gaps. So it's important to understand that even where there is good connectivity, not everyone uses it. But where there isn't good connectivity, then sometimes that results in usage gaps, because there may be people who are crying out for good digital services, or the ability to get online, but they just can't because the network isn't there. So usage gaps can be the result of connectivity gaps, but they can also be the result of other factors. For example, lack of digital skills, lack of or difficulty in affording either connectivity or services or devices, clearly linked to low income, and sometimes to employment status, which we discussed in the previous slide, and also some attitudinal factors. So sometimes people find it daunting to get online. That's linked to their low digital skills. There is a lot of information out there and justifiable concern about use of people's personal data when they go online, and that can constrain people. And some people, we have found in our studies, just resent the fact that they need to be online to do everything, and that is another resistance factor. So there are these demand side factors which constrain usage, as well as the connectivity gaps, which policymakers are focused on in a lot of jurisdictions. Talking about how to address these barriers then. So we're going to talk about this at quite a high level. As with everything else in this presentation, we don't really have time to go into it in any depth, but perhaps there'll be opportunities for Q&A, and also I'm happy to engage with anyone offline on these things as well. So firstly, a fairly obvious point, so connectivity is the cornerstone. You can't have any level of digital engagement if you don't have a network there. But it's important to understand that once you do have a network, there are still the demand side factors, which I've explained. But when those demand side factors are also addressed, you can actually achieve a really kind of neat vicious circle, which I've tried to present in the graphic on the left hand of this slide. Because once you address those demand side factors, taking account of the fact that the digital markets are static and new capabilities, new services are emerging all the time. So once you overcome people's resistance, you overcome their barriers to engagement, you then potentially create more demand, and then that increased demand feeds the supply side as well, and you create a vicious circle, a virtuous circle, I should say, of increased demand feeding the business case for increased engagement in upgrades to infrastructure. Upgrades to infrastructure in turn gives rise to opportunities to create better quality services. And so once you overcome these barriers to engagement, you create a virtuous circle, and that's a really nice position to be in. Going back to our typology, when we look at how these barriers are being addressed in different jurisdictions, you obviously find differences because every place starts from a different base. And so typically, if you look in developing countries, you will see a focus on getting basic infrastructure in the ground. That might be, for example, through 2G networks or through satellite connectivity in some very remote parts of the world. But even there, it's important for policymakers to understand once they fix those problems, there are still likely to be demand side gaps. In developing countries, we are much more focused on upgrades to infrastructure, creating the capability for customers to connect to very high speed networks, direct connections through fiber or 5G, and then the ability to address the residual demand side gaps which remain, but which tend to be less prominent in developed countries. So moving on then to talk about our case study, which I hope will illustrate some of the points I've tried to explain. Just an overview of the case study. We've been working with the local enterprise partnership in Cheshire and Warrington in the northwest of England. Local enterprise partnerships may be familiar to some of you. Basically, they're non-statutory bodies and they're responsible for economic development in an area, and they tend to be, well, they are partnerships between local authorities, businesses in that location, and other interested stakeholders. And the Cheshire and Warrington LEP commissioned us to look at barriers to digital connectivity and engagement in their area. And we did this in two stages. Firstly, we did a study to try and understand the barriers, looking across residential and businesses. And secondly, we made recommendations to the LEP to see how their strategy, and they had a pre-existing approach to this and strategic approach, but see how they might adjust that to better address the barriers which we'd identified. Going to say a little bit about our methodology. Firstly, those of you who are familiar with the UK will probably know that there's pretty good infrastructure data available. It's not perfect, but you can get infrastructure data at local authority level from Ofcom. They update it quarterly. And we were able to supplement that by looking at provider coverage checkers for both broadband and mobile. And then there were independent third-party coverage sources. For example, we used Think Broadband to look at the cable network in particular, for reasons I'll explain. So we were able to get pretty good data on infrastructure and therefore look fairly comprehensively at where there might be supply side gaps, i.e. lack of infrastructure. And we looked at broadband connectivity covering superfast, ultrafast and USO level connectivity. For ultrafast, Ofcom has very good data on fiber coverage, but less so on cable coverage. And as we know, the cable network can deliver very high speeds, and that's where we tended to use other third-party independent sources like Think Broadband. We looked at 4G mobile coverage. 5G data is much less easily available and much less granular, so we focused on 4G. So we had good data on the supply side. Data on the demand side was harder to find at local level, so we developed a proxy methodology for that, which I'll explain in the next slide. We also partnered with a research company, I2 Media Research. I2 ran 4 research groups, 2 online and 2 in the region, so we could get some qualitative data from consumer and business perspective through these research groups we ran, and obviously we looked at available literature as well. I'm going to tell you a bit about how we looked at the demand side, because as I've said, supply side data was readily available, demand side was harder, and therefore I think this is quite interesting. There is good data available on digital engagement if you look less granular. So if you look in the Northwest region, or you look nationally, you can get this data from the Office of National Statistics, from Deloitte's Consumer Digital Index, for example. And we were able then to use that in combination with local demographic data to try and create a map of digital engagement in Cheshire and Warrington. We looked at the lower layer super output area data, which is used by the ONS and a number of other authorities in the UK to map data locally. LSOAs generally tend to cover between 1,000 and 3,000 people, so it'll be a number of postcodes. That's quite good granular and good data for this purpose. And using that, we're able to look at internet user classification per LSOA, and that basically tells you a little bit about people's digital engagement. We're able to look at the index of multiple deprivation per local super output area. We looked at skills deprivation and income deprivation, and then we also looked at the census returns to see where censuses had been returned more predominantly in paper form than digital form. We thought that was insightful, and from that we were able to build a map of digital engagement in Cheshire and Warrington, which I've illustrated in that table on the right. So very quickly, we were able to tell which of the lower layer super output areas had income and skills deprivation, and where those corresponded with with internet user profiles 7, 8, 9, and 10, which are the lower level profiles. That then gives you a map of where people are likely to be less engaged and why they're likely to be less engaged. For example, if you're in an LSOA with income deprivation, then it's likely to be an affordability problem, and you can map your remedies accordingly. So very quickly on our findings, on the supply side, reasonable levels of coverage. We did find that there were gaps, and we also found from our qualitative review with I2 that sometimes consumer experience didn't match the reported data. So we'd have people tell us they weren't experiencing good quality coverage, where the data reported by Ofcom and elsewhere said it was well covered. That's not unexpected, and there is the opportunity to do deep dives where you find that. There was some dissatisfaction by small businesses. We found on the demand side, using our LSOA analysis, that there are likely to be 3 sources of digital disengagement. Those are low digital skills, affordability, and then finally attitudinal factors. So we experience resistance to digital engagement, perhaps because of fear of loss of your data, or low digital skills, or other reasons which may constrain engagement. We came up with a report which had 9 recommended actions and key performance indicators, which we delivered to the Cheshire and Warrington LEP, and they very kindly agreed for it to be published. They published it on their website, or you can find it on the Plum website. Very quickly, because I'm over time, but I think I can give myself a minute or 2 more. Regulation of digital markets is nascent, it's in development, and currently there are a number of initiatives around the globe which we think give regulators and policymakers the opportunity to try and address some of these barriers to digital engagement. So across the European Union, we have the Digital Markets Act, which is protecting consumers and user rights. The Digital Markets Act, which is focused on competition. The Digital Services Act, I should have said, is more about protection of user rights. And then the Gigabit Infrastructure Act, which is looking at incentives and creating the right environment for infrastructure rollout. In the UK, we have similar online safety bill, which looks after similar subject areas as the Digital Services Act, and the new Digital Markets Consumer and Competition Bill, which is about competition. And there are other initiatives, and I've cited an Australian example there as well. Now, when we look at the barriers, we look at our typology. These legislative and regulatory reform initiatives should give policymakers opportunities to try and address people's resistance to getting online. They're going to address supply side gaps. For example, the Gigabit Infrastructure Act is designed to do that, but they should also be able to reassure people about the levels of protection available to them, about redress, for example, overcome people's resistance to digital engagement, and therefore address barriers to digital engagement on the demand side. I'm just going to wrap up with those points. Just to recap, the barriers are multi-dimensional. They're on the supply and demand side. There are differences depending on where you look in the world and even within countries. we are able to develop a methodology in Plum to identify and potentially to address demand side barriers to engagement. And then finally, that last point, we think there are initiatives, the current initiatives for regulatory and legislative reform of digital services are opportunities to address these barriers. So apologies for running over. That's just a contact page, which I'll finish with. Please feel free to reach out to me if you want to follow any of this up. And I'll hand back to Ord. Thank you, Ord.
Thanks very much, Chris. I was looking at the Q&A box, and I don't think we have some. Yeah, we have. Sam is asking, I don't know if you can see the questions, Chris. You mentioned that new policy regulation will reduce demand-side barriers by alleviating consumer concerns, but to what extent will digitally disengaged consumers be aware of these?
That's a really good point. So I'm just opening the Q&A, and it's taking a while to open. That's a really good point. That's a very good point. And actually, that's one of the big challenges we find as well, because in trying to reach out to the digitally disengaged, one of the biggest one of the best channels you have, i.e. digital services, is closed off to you. So there are a number of ways in which policymakers are trying to address this. Sometimes it's through improving digital engagement, and sometimes this can be done through targeting particularly disengaged groups. So when we were doing the Cheshire and Warrington study, for example, we worked with Age UK to access the older population, and we're able to they were able to do that on our behalf and on behalf of the LEP using a number of channels which weren't digital. Similarly, with people, with job seekers who often will access physical bricks and mortar facilities in order to search for jobs, we can access them that way. And I think one of the big policy challenges in making digital regulation effective is ensuring that all channels for digital engagement and education about digital services are kept open. Sometimes that's through local stakeholders, sometimes through national stakeholders. Thanks. I can't open the Q&A for some reason, so you'll have
That's
to.
okay. That's okay. Yeah. So another question: what has been the most challenging with the project? Is it to capture the lack of skills?
Yeah. So two things. One is I think the first questioner actually already identified one of the big difficulties we had, which was getting access to real evidence about people who are resistant to digital services or can't engage with digital services, because one of our main channels to them would have been through digital engagement. So that's one. I've just described that. Data is mixed, but I'd say that in the UK we're quite fortunate, and looking particularly on the supply side, even though the Ofcom data is not perfect, it is updated regularly. It does cover the whole country, and it's pretty comprehensive. You then have the opportunity potentially to supplement that data. As I've said, we found in doing the interviews that some people's experience of digital services and connectivity didn't match what you'd expect it to be just by looking at the connectivity data. That's challenging, but there are ways in which you can overcome that with a little bit more research. So, for example, I know that stakeholders in the Northwest, not the LEP, but other stakeholders who are interested in connectivity, have commissioned another drive test by another consultancy company to look at the ability for people to connect and the quality of experience on the transport network in that part of the country. So there's supplemental data available there. But to answer the question, I think yes, the mix of data is a challenge, and I think being able to do this in the UK, we're quite fortunate. I think if you went to other countries and tried to replicate this study, you'd need to be even more creative in finding data sources, because you probably wouldn't have the wealth of data that we have, or the richness of data that we have on the supply side, which is a good baseline for us to build from on this.
Okay, and in terms of KPIs, the KPIs you recommended to the client,
Yeah.
is it, I mean, what type of KPIs? Can you elaborate a little bit on that? And do you provide also the sources where the client can find the data?
Yeah, so so both things. So I'll answer the second one first. So we were careful only to recommend, and these recommendations are with the LEP, by the way. They're not for us to deliver them, but we did identify data sources. So where there is a KPI, for example, on connectivity, you can track that using the same data sources we used for the study. Where there are KPIs which relate to the demand side, take up of services, for example. Firstly, as I said when I presented the case study, we didn't have a baseline of data. So in order to develop a case study, you need to develop that baseline. There are ways in which you can do that, perhaps through doing regular tracking surveys, which the client may want to develop, and then you need, obviously, to do it over time. Data is much more powerful and much more useful when you have a time series of it. So some of these KPIs you would need new organic data for. Some there is well-established data sources. Sorry, what was the first part of the question? Or so I'll answer the second part first. I
Was
lost
about
track of
some,
the first.
yeah, was about some examples of KPIs that you recommend to follow.
Oh yeah,
I don't know if this
okay.
is something you can provide.
Yeah, so if you look at our reports, they're all published in the second report we did for the Cheshire and Warrington LEP, but they cover the same things that we were trying to identify. So whether there are good levels of connectivity, tracking Ofcom data, digital skill, things which will identify which will measure people's ability to engage with digital services. So, for example, their digital skills. We can track things like take up of social tariffs for broadband, which gives some quite good data on affordability. And also, one thing that was very interesting as this project developed is the number of stakeholders who are interested. So that there are stakeholders outside of the LEP, but in the same part of the country, who are very interested and are contributing data for this exercise as well. For example, the Cheshire and Merseyside NHS, they're very interested in digital engagement in healthcare for obvious reasons, and they are able to contribute data as well.
Thanks, Chris. Another question, did you get any view from the service providers or operators, any incentives to improve networks, quality of service and quality of experience?
So actually, the networks weren't really involved in this study. Obviously, we used data from them in developing our findings, and we also looked at, how networks are being developed both in the industry and also under, regulatory and policy oversight through things like the Broadband UK program. But actually, the involvement by the operators directly wasn't really part of our study here.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I don't think we have other questions. Let me check Q&A and the chat. Yeah, maybe a last question, Chris. Did you come across situations in which demand for connectivity was lacking, even though there was no connectivity supply gap? How do you explain that?
Yes. So if I understand the question, were there examples where there was good infrastructure, good connectivity, but there was still unmet demand? Yes. So
Okay.
yeah. Okay. So yes, there are examples of that, and actually, I think that's right at the heart of where there's a particular challenge here for policymakers and other stakeholders, because precisely we're trying to understand why people why demand is constrained, even though there is supply. Now, sometimes it's because people just don't want to use digital services or want to use them less. I think that's fine as long as they have access to the essential things that they need to transact online, things like digital healthcare and digital education, or local services digitally. But other times people are unable to, there is demand, but people just are unable to use things because lack of digital skills, or because they can't afford the services because they are on low income. And that's where there is a big job, I think, for policymakers to try and develop interventions. Some of those interventions need to connect people to facilities which are already available to them, but which they're not taking advantage of. For example, social tariffs I just mentioned. We know there's low awareness and low take up of social tariffs in the UK, even though a lot of people use them, and affordability is a constraint on demand for some people. So there's a job there for, firstly, I think industry, but then also other stakeholders in the community and perhaps the regulator to improve awareness of social tariffs so we can drive take up. So yes, we found a lot of that. Designing the remedies and the solutions in order to overcome those barriers is one of the big challenges.
All right, thanks, Chris. So I don't think we have more questions. Thank you very much. I think we can wrap up. Thank you all for joining our webinar today. I hope it gives you some food for thoughts. You can download the slides on our company website. I'll send you the link by email, and I hope to see you again at our next webinar. It will probably take place in October. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris, and have a nice day.